At 6:30 a.m. on November 17th, 1944, Sergeant Frank Miller crouched in a muddy crater just outside the German town of Aachen, watching his breath mist in the freezing air. His hands were shaking, but not from the cold. He was gripping a pair of binoculars that were splattered with the grime of 3 weeks of non-stop combat. Through the scratched lenses, he was watching the tree line to the east, a dark wall of pine that looked innocent enough to a civilian. But Miller was not a civilian. He was a dogface, a grunt of the 1st Infantry Division, and he knew that the forest was not empty. It was waiting. And what was waiting inside those trees was not just men with rifles. It was something heavier, something that made the ground tremble before you even saw it. Miller lowered the glasses and looked at his platoon. They were a mess. They looked less like soldiers and more like a group of hobos who had stolen weapons. Their uniforms were caked in a layer of mud, so thick it had dried into a kind of natural armor. Their eyes were red-rimmed and hollow, staring at nothing. They were down to half strength. They had no radio contact with headquarters. They had no artillery support, and worst of all, they had no tanks. The Shermans that had been supporting their advance had been chewed up and spit out 2 days ago. They were alone on a ridge in enemy territory, and the silence was heavy enough to crush a man's chest. To understand why Frank Miller was sweating in freezing temperatures, you have to understand the weapon that had put him there. The war in Europe was not just a fight between men, it was a fight between machines, and for 3 years, the undisputed heavyweight champion of that fight was a weapon the Germans called the Act, the 88. To the history books, it was the Flak 36 anti-aircraft gun. But to the men on the ground, it was simply the boogeyman. It was the thing that lived in your nightmares. It was a weapon that was not supposed to exist, a piece of engineering that broke all the rules of fairness. The 88 was originally designed to shoot down airplanes. It was a sky gun. It fired a shell the size of a man's leg into the stratosphere to knock bombers out of the clouds. To do that, the German engineers had given it a barrel long enough to be a telephone pole, and a powder charge that could accelerate a piece of steel to supersonic speeds in the blink of an eye. It was a precise, delicate instrument of high-altitude murder. But somewhere in the deserts of North Africa, a desperate German commander had looked at his anti-aircraft guns, then looked at the British tanks charging his line, and had a crazy idea. He lowered the barrel. He pointed the sky gun at the ground. The result was the military equivalent of using a sledgehammer to kill a fly. When an 88mm shell hit a tank, it did not just punch a hole. It hit with such catastrophic violence that it often blew the turret clean off the hull. It turned armored vehicles into scrap metal and brave crews into memories. It could kill a tank from 2 miles away, long before the tank crew even knew they were in a fight. It was the weapon that terrified the Allies more than any other. You could hide from a machine gun. You could dig a hole to escape a mortar, but if an 88 could see you, you were already dead. And now Sergeant Miller was sitting on top of a battery of them. That was the irony of the situation. Miller's platoon had just overrun a German artillery position on the ridge. They had caught the enemy crews sleeping. It had been a short, brutal fight with grenades and bayonets, and when the smoke cleared, the Germans were either dead or running for the hills. The Americans now owned the ridge, and sitting there in the mud, pointing up at the grey sky, were 4 pristine 88mm guns. They were beautiful in a terrifying way. They were painted in camouflage patterns of ambush yellow and forest green. They looked sleek, dangerous, and expensive. And to Frank Miller, they looked completely useless. I spent 6 hours writing, editing, and publishing this video, paying attention to every detail to honor the soldiers in this story. If this story matters to you, the only thing I ask is that you subscribe to the channel. Just subscribe, that's all. Thank you. The problem with capturing German weapons was that you could not just pick them up and use them. An American rifle was a simple tool like a hammer. A German 88 was a scientific instrument. It was covered in dials, hand cranks, and optical sights that looked like they belonged in a laboratory. It required a crew of 10 highly trained specialists to operate. You needed a spotter, a rangefinder, a fuse setter, a loader, a gunner, and a commander who knew trigonometry. You needed firing tables and ballistic computers. It was a weapon designed by professors for professionals. It was not designed for a bunch of exhausted farm boys from Kansas who had not slept in 48 hours. Miller walked over to the nearest gun and ran his hand over the cold steel of the breech. It was massive, a solid block of metal that looked like the door of a bank vault. He saw the brass instruction plates riveted to the side, covered in German words he could not read. He saw the complex, devastating web of gears that controlled the elevation and traverse. It was a masterpiece of engineering. It was the Rolex of death, and right now, it was nothing but a 9,000-pound paperweight. Miller kicked the tire in frustration. He knew what was coming. He could feel it in the soles of his boots. The sound started as a low vibration, a thrumming that you felt in your gut rather than heard with your ears. Then came the squeal. It was the distinctive metal-on-metal screech of dry tracks turning on a rusted drive sprocket. Then the engine noise, a guttural coughing roar that sounded like a dragon clearing its throat. The men in the foxholes froze. They stopped cleaning their rifles. They stopped eating their cold rations. Every head turned toward the east. They knew that sound. It was the sound of the predator returning to reclaim its cave. A private named Jenkins scrambled up to Miller's position. His face was pale, the color of dirty snow. He did not have to say anything. They both knew what was out there. The German counterattack was not infantry. It was not a few trucks. It was armor. And judging by the depth of the engine roar, it was not light armor. It was the heavy stuff. It was Tigers. The Tiger tank was the partner to the 88. It was the monster that carried the Sky gun on its back. It had armor so thick that American shells bounced off it like pebbles. It was a moving fortress that could drive through a house without slowing down. Miller looked at his defensive line. He had 2 bazookas left. 2, and they were down to their last 3 rockets. A bazooka was a brave weapon, but against the frontal armor of a Tiger, it was a joke. You had to get within 50 yards, survive the machine gun fire, and hit the tracks or the rear engine deck. It was a suicide mission. Other than that, they had rifles and a few grenades. They were about to fight a tank with pocket knives. The realization hit Miller like a punch to the stomach. They were going to die here. They were going to be overrun, crushed into the mud and forgotten. He looked back at the captured 88s. They sat there in their sandbagged pits, mocking him. The barrels were pointed uselessly at the clouds, waiting for bombers that were not coming. They were the most powerful weapons on the battlefield, and they were right in his hands. Yet, they might as well have been on the moon. The experts would tell you that you cannot fire an 88 without the fire control computer. They would tell you that without the proper fuse settings, the shell is just a dumb rock. They would tell you that a bunch of infantrymen trying to operate a complex artillery piece was a recipe for disaster. Miller watched the tree line. The first tree fell. It did not just fall, it was pushed over. A massive boxy shape coated in Zimmerit anti-magnetic paste emerged from the shadows. The muzzle brake of its long gun looked like the eye of a tunnel. Then another one appeared, then a third. 3 Tigers. They were moving in a wedge formation, their hulls rocking gently as they crushed the undergrowth. They were hunting. They knew the Americans were on the ridge. They knew the Americans had no tanks. They were coming to sweep the trash off their hill. Panic began to ripple through the platoon. Men were looking at Miller, their eyes begging for an order to retreat. They wanted to run. They wanted to get off this cursed hill before the monsters got within range, and Miller could not blame them. Running was the logical thing to do. Running was the survival instinct kicking in. But Miller knew something about running. If you ran from a tank in open country, you just died tired. The Tigers would cut them down with machine guns before they made it halfway to the river. There was no retreat. There was only the ridge. Miller looked at the lead Tiger. It was 400 yards away. He looked at the number 1 gun. He looked at the massive breech block. He did not see a scientific instrument anymore. He did not see a complex anti-aircraft system. He saw a pipe, a big, heavy steel pipe that could throw a rock really hard. He remembered something his grandfather had told him about fixing tractors on the farm. If the engine does not start, hit it with a wrench. If that does not work, get a bigger wrench. You do not need to understand the manual to make the machine work. You just need to understand the basics. He walked over to the gun pit. He jumped down into the mud next to the wheel. He looked at Jenkins and 2 other terrified privates. He did not scream. He did not give a speech about glory. He pointed at the breech. "Open it," he said. The men stared at him. "Sarge, that's a Kraut gun," Jenkins stammered. "We don't know how to work it. It's got computers and stuff." Miller grabbed the heavy steel handle on the breech block. It was cold and greasy. "I don't care about the computers," Miller growled. "It's a gun. It has a hole at one end and a trigger at the other. We're going to figure it out." He shoved the handle. The mechanism was stiff, fighting him. It did not want to be opened by an American hand. Miller put his shoulder into it. He grunted, straining against the German steel. With a metallic clunk that sounded like a vault opening, the breech block slid down. The chamber lay open, a dark, hungry mouth waiting to be fed. Miller looked through the barrel. He could see a circle of daylight at the other end. He could see the trees. He turned to the pile of ammunition crates stacked against the wall of the pit. "Grab a shell," he ordered. "The big ones with the pointy tips." The men hesitated. This was insanity. This was against every regulation in the book. You do not fire captured heavy artillery without training. You do not engage tanks with anti-aircraft guns using manual sights. It was a great way to blow yourself up. But then the Tiger fired. The sound was a sharp, cracking thunderclap. A high explosive shell slammed into the ridge 50 yards away, throwing a fountain of dirt and shrapnel into the air. The shockwave knocked Jenkins down. That was the decision point. The debate was over. The experts could argue about safety protocols later. Right now, the only safety protocol was killing the thing that was trying to kill them. Miller grabbed Jenkins by the collar and hauled him up. I said, "Grab a shell." The plan forming in Miller's mind was crude. It was dangerous. It was stupid. The German gunners used optical sights and math to aim. Miller was going to use his eyeballs. He was going to point the barrel like a giant finger. He was going to strip away the science and turn the 88 into the world's biggest pistol. He climbed into the gunner's seat, his knees knocking against the metal handwheels. He grabbed the traverse wheel. It felt heavy, dead. He spun it. The long barrel groaned and began to turn. It was slow, it was heavy, and the Tigers were getting closer with every second. Miller gritted his teeth. He was not a scientist, he was a dogface, and he was about to give the master race a lesson in American stubbornness. The inside of a German 88mm gun position was not designed for comfort. It was a tangle of hand cranks, foot pedals, and steel levers that looked like the controls of a steam locomotive. Sergeant Miller sat in the gunner's metal bucket seat, his knees pressed against his chest, staring at a dashboard of dials that made absolutely no sense. There were gauges for hydraulic pressure, azimuth indicators marked in degrees, and ballistic charts riveted to the shield that listed flight times for aircraft at 20,000 feet. It was a language of mathematics, and Miller had failed algebra in the 8th grade. He grabbed the two heavy iron wheels in front of him. The one on the left controlled the traverse, swinging the gun left and right. The one on the right was for elevation, tilting the massive barrel up and down. He gave the elevation wheel a hard crank. It resisted, stiff with cold grease before the gears caught. The long barrel, which was currently pointing harmlessly at the grey clouds, began to lower. It came down slowly, inch by agonizing inch, like a falling tree. Miller spun the wheel faster, sweat breaking out on his forehead despite the freezing air. He had to get the muzzle level with the ground. He had to turn a weapon designed to shoot eagles into a weapon that could shoot rats. The barrel finally leveled out, locking into a horizontal position that looked unnatural for an anti-aircraft gun. It looked predatory. It looked like a finger pointing directly at the approaching death. But aiming was the real problem. The German optical sight was a complex tube of glass and prisms mounted on the side of the gun. Miller pressed his eye against the rubber cup. All he saw was a blur of crosshairs and range markers that were calibrated for targets 3 miles away. At this range, looking through the sight was like trying to read a newspaper through a telescope. It was useless. He could not find the Tigers in the glass. He pulled his head back and cursed. The tank engines were getting louder, a grinding mechanical roar that vibrated the fillings in his teeth. He did not have time to learn how to be a German artilleryman. He had to cheat. "Open the breech," Miller yelled. Jenkins, standing by the rear of the gun, grabbed the heavy lever and threw it down. The massive steel block slid open, revealing the empty chamber. Miller jumped out of the gunner's seat and ran to the back of the gun. He shoved Jenkins aside and put his face right up to the open rear of the barrel. He looked straight through the 30-foot steel tube. At the far end, framed in a perfect circle of daylight, he saw the muddy field. This was bore sighting. It was the oldest trick in the book, a method used by desperate gunners since the days of wooden cannons. If you could see the target through the pipe, the shell would hit the target. It was simple, it was crude, and it was the only option they had. Miller grabbed the traverse wheel from the side, spinning it frantically while keeping one eye looking down the barrel. The world inside the tube shifted. The trees slid past. The burning wreck of a jeep slid past, and then the circle of light was filled with grey steel. The lead Tiger tank was centered perfectly in the bore. It was so close that Miller could see the mud caked on its spare track links. He could see the commander's hatch open. He locked the hand wheels. "Load it!" he screamed, jumping back into the gunner's seat. "Put a shell in the pipe." The ammunition for the 88 was not a small object. The cartridge was over 3 feet long, a brass casing topped with a wicked aerodynamic steel projectile. It weighed nearly 40 pounds. Private Reynolds, a kid from Ohio who looked like he should still be delivering newspapers, grabbed a round from the crate. He struggled with the weight, slipping in the mud. He hugged the cold brass against his chest and stumbled toward the breech. He was not gentle. He rammed the nose of the shell into the chamber and shoved it home with the heel of his hand. The rim of the casing clicked against the extractors. Now came the dangerous part. The breech block on an 88 was semi-automatic and spring-loaded. As soon as the shell tripped the catch, the block would slam upward with enough force to crush a human hand into pulp. Reynolds knew this. He shoved the shell and snatched his fingers back as if he had touched a hot stove. The block snapped shut with a metallic clang that sounded like a prison door closing. The gun was live. It was hot. A 19-pound projectile packed with high explosives was sitting in the chamber, waiting for a spark. Miller put his foot on the firing pedal. He did not check the sights again. He just trusted the line. The Tiger tank was now 300 yards away. In the world of tank warfare, that is point-blank range. It is knife-fighting distance. The German commander in the lead tank must have seen the barrel of the 88 drop. He must have seen the muzzle turn toward him, but he probably did not believe it. He knew the Americans did not have any heavy guns. He probably thought the position was abandoned or that the gun had been knocked out. He kept coming, his tracks churning the black earth, his 88mm gun pointing straight ahead. He was confident. He was invincible. He was wrong. Miller stomped on the pedal. He did not just press it. He kicked it with every ounce of fear and adrenaline in his body. The gun did not make a normal sound. It did not bang. It cracked. It was a physical snap of air pressure that felt like a slap in the face. A 10-foot tongue of flame erupted from the muzzle brake, kicking up a massive cloud of dust and dead leaves. The 9,000-pound gun leaped backward on its wheels, the recoil spades digging deep furrows into the ground. The entire world turned white for a split second. Miller was thrown back against the metal seat, his ears ringing with a high-pitched whine that drowned out the world. The shell left the barrel at 2,600 feet per second. At that speed, gravity is just a suggestion. The round did not arc, it did not drop. It traveled in a perfectly straight line, a laser beam of hardened steel. Because they were so close, there was no travel time. The gun fired and the impact happened instantly. But because Miller had aimed by looking through the barrel, he had not accounted for the drift or the jump of the gun. The shell screamed past the turret of the lead Tiger, missing the steel by inches. It passed between the first and second tank and slammed into a large oak tree in the background. The tree did not splinter. It vaporized. The trunk simply ceased to exist, turning into a cloud of wood chips and sap. The mist was terrifying, but it had an effect. The German column froze. The lead Tiger slammed on its brakes, the massive hull rocking violently on its suspension. The commander dropped into the turret and slammed the hatch. They knew the surprise was gone. The Americans were not just watching. They were shooting back with the Germans' own weapons. The turret of the lead Tiger began to rotate. It turned with a slow mechanical menace, the long barrel swinging around to find the source of the fire. The electric motors whined as the 88mm gun hunted for Miller. "Missed!" Jenkins screamed, his voice cracking. "You missed him, Sarge!" Miller did not need the commentary. He was already spinning the traverse wheel, trying to correct his aim. "Reload!" he roared. "Get another one in there!" The crew was clumsy. They were terrified. Reynolds was fumbling with the next shell, his hands slick with mud. He dropped it, the heavy brass clanging against the gun mount. "Pick it up," Miller yelled. "Pick it up, or we're dead." The Tiger's turret was halfway around. The black hole of its muzzle was looking for them. The dynamics of the fight had shifted instantly. A moment ago, it was an ambush. Now it was a duel, and it was an unfair duel. The Tiger had a telescopic sight, a trained crew, and a coaxial machine gun. Miller had a manual traverse wheel and a bunch of kids. The Tiger's machine gun opened up first. Tracers zipped over the lip of the gun pit, snapping through the air like angry hornets. They sparked off the gun shield, sending splinters of lead flying into the mud. Jenkins hit the deck, covering his head. The suppression fire was doing its job. It was keeping their heads down while the tank lined up the kill shot. Miller stayed in the seat. He hunched down behind the steel shield, cranking the wheel blindly. He knew he had to move the aim to the left. He had missed to the right. He did not have time to open the breech and bore sight again. He had to do it by feel. He had to guess. It was like trying to shoot a moving deer from the hip while someone was throwing rocks at your face. He felt the vibration of the bullets hitting the shield. He felt the heat radiating from the barrel. He was operating on pure instinct, the kind of animal panic that shuts down the higher brain and leaves only the lizard brain in charge. Reynolds managed to pick up the shell. He was crying, tears streaming down his dirty face, but he was moving. He shoved the round into the breech. He punched it home. The block slammed shut. "Up!" Reynolds screamed. The gun was ready. Miller peeked over the top of the shield. The Tiger was stationary now. The hull was angled, presenting the thickest armor to the Americans. The turret had stopped rotating. The gun was pointing directly at Miller's face. It was a staring contest between two identical weapons, one mounted on a tank, one sitting in the mud. But the Germans were not alone. The second Tiger in the line had moved up. It pushed through the brush, flanking to the right. It was trying to get a side angle on the American position. The situation was spiraling out of control. Miller had one gun, one loaded shell, and two heavy tanks bearing down on him. The ground beneath them shook as the second Tiger accelerated, its engine screaming as it chewed up the slope. They were closing the distance. They were not going to sit back and snipe. They were going to overrun the position and crush the guns under their tracks. Miller looked at the lead tank. He could see the flash of the muzzle brake as the Tiger fired. He did not hear the shot. He saw the shell coming. It looked like a black blur, a smudge in the air. It hit the dirt berm 10 feet in front of their gun pit. The explosion was deafening. A wall of wet earth and sandbags was thrown into the air, burying Miller and the gun controls in a landslide of debris. The concussion knocked the wind out of him. He gasped, spitting mud, wiping his eyes. He was still alive. The German gunner had fired high. He had aimed for the center of the pit but hit the lip. Miller scrambled back to the wheel. The gun was still functional. The debris had piled up around the wheels, but the barrel was clear. He wiped the mud off the firing pedal. He looked down the side of the barrel. The Tiger was reloading. He could see the puffs of smoke from its exhaust. He had about 6 seconds before the next round came in, and the next one would not be high. The German gunner would correct his aim. He would drop the next shell right into Miller's lap. This was it, the race. The German loader in the tank was shoving a shell into his breech. Reynolds had already loaded Miller's gun. It came down to who could pull the trigger first. Miller cranked the wheel one last time, adjusting for the miss. He did not aim for the hull. The hull was too thick. He aimed a little higher. He aimed for the joint where the turret met the body, the weak spot, the neck. He took a breath, holding the freezing air in his lungs to steady his shaking leg. He watched the Tiger. He watched the black barrel, and he stomped the pedal. The second shot did not just feel different. It sounded different. When the first round had missed, the energy had dissipated into the forest, a wasted thunderclap. But this time, the connection was solid. Miller stomped the pedal, and the 88 bucked violently, sliding back 2 feet in the mud. The recoil system groaned as it absorbed the massive kinetic punch. The brass casing ejected with a hollow clunk, spinning in the air and landing in the slush, steaming hot. But Miller was not looking at the casing. He was looking at the Tiger. At 300 yards, the flight time was 0. The armor-piercing shell slammed into the Tiger's turret ring, the one vertical trap in its sloped armor. The impact did not just bend the steel, it liquefied it. The massive bolts holding the turret to the chassis sheared off instantly. To the men watching from the foxholes, it looked like a magic trick. The Tiger's massive turret, which weighed 11 tons on its own, lifted straight up into the air. It was a violent, jagged uppercut. The turret disconnected from the chassis, flipped backward in a lazy, terrifying arc, and crashed onto the rear engine deck of the tank. The barrel, which had been pointing at Miller a second ago, was now pointing uselessly at the sky. A gout of flame erupted from the open hole where the turret used to be, a pillar of fire reaching 20 feet high. The ammunition inside the tank had cooked off. The masterpiece was dead. "Got him!" Reynolds screamed, his voice raw. "You took his head off." There was no time to celebrate. The burning Tiger was now a roadblock, a flaming wreck in the middle of the field. But behind it, the second Tiger was still moving, and the crew of that second tank was now very, very angry. They had just watched their platoon leader get decapitated by a captured gun. They were not going to make the same mistake of sitting still. The second Tiger revved its engine and slewed sideways, accelerating toward the tree line to find cover. "Traverse right!" Miller yelled, spinning the wheel. "He's running!" The heavy gun fought him. The 88 was a stationary hunter. It was not designed to track a moving target at close range. The gears were too slow. Miller cranked the handle with both hands, his muscles burning. The long barrel chased the tank, but the Tiger was faster. It disappeared behind a thicket of pines, its engine roar fading slightly as it maneuvered for a flank shot. Miller knew what it was doing. It was circling. It was going to come out on their right side where the gun shield offered zero protection. "We need to move the gun," Miller shouted. He jumped out of the seat, grabbed the trails. "We have to spin the whole carriage." This was impossible. The Flak 36 weighed over 15,000 pounds when fully deployed. Ideally, you folded up the side legs and put it on wheels to move it. They did not have time for that. They had to physically drag the trails, the long stabilizing legs through the mud to rotate the entire firing platform. Jenkins and 3 other dogfaces jumped out of their holes and grabbed the heavy steel beams. "Heave," Miller grunted, his boots slipping in the sludge. "Heave." The men strained, veins popping in their necks. The gun did not move. It was sucked into the Rhineland mud like a tombstone. "Come on, you lazy bums," Miller screamed. "Push!" They threw their shoulders into the steel. Slowly, agonizingly, the massive weapon began to slide. The mud made a sucking sound as it released its grip. They rotated the gun 45 degrees to the right, pointing it toward the patch of woods where the Tiger had vanished. "Load," Miller gasped, climbing back into the seat. Reynolds grabbed another shell. This one was covered in grit. He wiped it on his sleeve and shoved it in. The breech slammed. They were ready. They waited. The woods were silent. The burning Tiger in the field crackled and popped, the black smoke drifting across the clearing, but from the right flank there was nothing. No engine noise, no movement. "Where is he?" Jenkins whispered. Miller scanned the trees. The Tiger was a predator. It was stalking them. It could be waiting for them to reveal themselves, or it could be crawling through a ravine to come up behind them. Then Miller saw it. A glint of metal. Not in the woods, but through the woods. The German commander was smart. He had not come out into the open. He was staying deep in the timber, using the trees as a screen. He was going to fire through the forest. A tree at the edge of the woodline suddenly exploded. The Tiger had fired blindly, clearing a lane of fire with a high explosive shell. The tree toppled, crashing down and revealing the grey hull sitting in the shadows. It was hull down, buried in a depression. Only the turret was visible. It was a sniper's position. The German gunner had a perfect shot at the exposed side of Miller's gun. Miller did not have time to aim properly. He did not have time to bore sight. He did the only thing he could think of. He used the splash method. He spun the elevation wheel, pointing the gun low. He was not aiming at the tank. He was aiming at the ground in front of the tank. "Fire!" he yelled. He stomped the pedal. The 88 roared. The shell slammed into the soft earth 20 yards in front of the Tiger. It did not hit the tank, but it did something else. The explosion threw up a curtain of dirt, rocks, and pulverized wood. It created an instant smoke screen. The Tiger fired a split second later, but the German gunner was blinded. His shell whizzed over Miller's head, missing the gun by feet. The wind of the passing shell knocked Reynolds down. "He can't see us," Miller yelled. "Hit him again, same spot." Reynolds loaded, Miller fired. Another geyser of dirt erupted in front of the woods. He was buying seconds, throwing the landscape into the enemy's face, but he could not hide forever. He had to hit that turret. The Tiger machine gunned the smoke, blindly spraying the area. Bullets pinged off the gun barrel. Miller adjusted his aim. He brought the muzzle up a fraction of an inch. He was guessing the elevation. He imagined the line of flight. He visualized the shell passing through the smoke and finding the steel. "Come on, baby," he whispered. "Don't fail me now." He fired. The gun bucked. The smoke cleared for a second, pushed away by the blast pressure. Through the haze, Miller saw a spark, a bright white flash on the Tiger's turret, a ricochet. The angle had been too steep. The shell had skipped off the rounded mantlet of the Tiger like a stone off a pond. It flew up into the sky, harmless. The German tank commander realized he had survived. He began to rotate his turret. He was going to drive out of the hole and finish this. The engine roared as the Tiger lurched forward, climbing out of its cover. It broke through the tree line, smashing saplings under its tracks. It was 50 yards away. It was a metal mountain. "Last shell!" Reynolds screamed. Miller looked at the crate. It was empty. The other crates were high explosive, useless against armor. They had one armor-piercing round left, one shot to stop a 60-ton monster. The Tiger was accelerating. It was not stopping to shoot. It was coming to ram them. The driver intended to run the 88 over, to grind the Americans into the mud. Miller watched the behemoth close the distance. 40 yards, 30 yards. He could see the Zimmerit pace pattern clearly. He could see the mud flying off the tracks. He forced himself to wait. He could not miss this. He could not ricochet. He needed a flat surface. He needed the driver's plate. The Tiger dipped into a small drainage ditch. For a split second, the nose of the tank went down, and the vertical armor plate in front of the driver flattened out relative to Miller's gun. It was a window of opportunity that would last less than a second. Miller did not think. He did not breathe. He stomped. The last AP shell left the barrel. It covered the 30 yards in less than the blink of an eye. It hit the driver's plate dead center. This time there was no ricochet. The shell punched through the armor, carrying all of its kinetic energy inside the cramped fighting compartment. The tank stopped instantly. It shuddered as if it had hit a brick wall. Smoke poured out of the driver's vision slit. The engine sputtered and died. The momentum carried it forward another 5 feet, sliding in the mud before it came to a halt, just 20 yards from Miller's face. Silence returned to the ridge. The ringing in Miller's ears was a constant high-pitched scream. He sat in the metal seat, his foot still pressed to the floor. He watched the tank. Nothing moved. No hatches opened. The monster was dead. The toy gun, the complicated scientific instrument, had done its job. It had killed its brothers. Miller slumped forward, resting his forehead on the cold steel of the breech. His hands were shaking so bad he could not let go of the wheels. He looked at the smoking barrel of the 88. "Well," he croaked, his voice raspy from the smoke. "That was fun while it lasted." He grabbed his M1 Garand rifle from the side of the pit. It felt light, like a toy after handling the artillery. "Get to the foxholes," he ordered. "We do the rest the hard way." Subscribe right now, because what you are about to hear is how the experts tried to take away Miller's gun, how a general overruled them, and how this single firefight changed American doctrine forever. This is the only channel showing you the real stories of men who refused to follow the rules when the rules meant dying. Do not miss this. The arrival of the reinforcements was not the dramatic cavalry charge you see in movies. It was slow, grinding, and loud. But this time, the noise was not coming from the east. It was coming from the west, from behind the American lines. The low rumble of radial engines filled the valley. Miller, crouching in his foxhole with his empty rifle, looked back. Cresting the hill behind them was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. It was not a tank. It was a jeep. And behind it a half-track, and behind that a column of Sherman tanks. their long 76mm guns pointing forward. The relief column had finally punched through. The Shermans rolled past Miller's position, their commanders waving from the hatches. They did not stop to admire the handiwork. They pushed straight past the burning Tigers, firing their machine guns into the tree line to clear out any stragglers. The threat that had almost wiped out Miller's platoon was suddenly irrelevant. The weight of the American industrial machine had arrived. An officer, a captain with clean boots and a map case, jumped out of the lead jeep. He walked over to where Miller was sitting. Miller did not stand up. He was too tired. He was scraping the mud off his boots with a stick. The captain looked at the scene. He looked at the two destroyed Tigers. He saw the first one with its turret ripped off, lying upside down on the engine deck. He saw the second one with a neat black hole punched through the driver's plate. Then he looked at the German 88 guns sitting in the pit. The gun was a wreck. The barrel was blackened and blistered from the heat. The recoil spades were buried 3 feet deep in the mud. Piles of hot brass casings littered the ground like spent cigarettes. The captain looked at Miller, then back at the gun. He looked confused. "Sergeant," the captain asked, pointing at the dead Tigers, "who killed those?" Miller looked up. He spat a glob of mud and tobacco juice onto the ground. "We did, sir," he said quietly. The captain frowned. "With what? Your bazookas?" Miller shook his head. He jerked a thumb at the German gun. "With that." The captain walked over to the 88. He ran a gloved hand over the breech. He looked at the optical sights, which were still covered in their leather caps. He looked at the crude, muddy footprints on the firing pedal. He realized what had happened. He looked back at Miller with a mixture of horror and respect. "You used their own gun?" he asked. "Without a fire control computer? Without a trained crew?" Miller nodded. "Didn't need them, sir," he said. "Point and click, point and click." The story of the 88 incident spread through the division like wildfire. Intelligence officers came up the next day to take pictures. They measured the distance from the gun to the first Tiger, 300 yards. They measured the impact velocity. They analyzed the shattered turret ring. They determined that the shot was a statistical anomaly, a 1 in a million hit. They wrote reports about the improvisational skills of the American infantrymen. They used phrases like unorthodox tactical adaptation and field expedient gunnery. But the experts missed the point. They were looking at the math. They were calculating the odds of a manual shot hitting a moving target. They did not understand that for Miller and his men there were no odds. There was just survival. They did not fire the gun because they calculated it would work. They fired it because the alternative was dying in a muddy hole. The 88 battery was eventually towed away. The engineers hooked the guns up to trucks and dragged them to the rear. They were painted over with white stars and put into service as American artillery pieces for the rest of the campaign. The captured Sky guns spent the rest of the war raining shells down on their former owners, but they never fired another shot like the one Miller took. That was a moment of singular, desperate clarity that could not be replicated. The official records show that on November 17, 1944, elements of the 1st Infantry Division engaged and destroyed 2 Tiger tanks using captured German artillery. What the records do not show is the phone call that came 3 days later. A colonel from Ordnance showed up at division headquarters. He was furious. He had heard about the incident. He wanted to know why untrained infantry were firing captured weapons. He wanted to know why there had been no safety protocols. He wanted to know who had authorized such a dangerous, reckless action. He demanded that the men be disciplined. He demanded that all captured weapons be immediately removed from the front lines. He was making his case to a brigadier general when the general held up his hand. The general was a combat veteran. He had been at Normandy. He had lost friends in the hedgerows. He listened to the colonel's lecture about proper procedure, about training requirements, about the inherent danger of using enemy equipment without understanding its systems. Then he asked a simple question. "Colonel," the general said, "how many men did we lose in this incident?" The colonel shuffled his papers. "None, sir, but that's not the point. The point is—" "No," the general interrupted. "That is exactly the point. No American casualties. 2 enemy tanks destroyed. Position held. Mission accomplished." He stood up and walked to the window. Do you know what the manual says about fighting tigers with bazookas? The colonel did not answer. It says you die, the general continued. The manual says you call for air support. The manual says you retreat and regroup. But Sergeant Miller didn't have air support. He couldn't retreat. So he looked at a pile of enemy guns and decided they were American guns now. The general turned around. You want to discipline him? You want to take those guns away? He walked over to the colonel. Those guns are staying on the front line, and if we capture more, we're going to use those too, because the only rule that matters out there is win the fight and bring your men home. Miller did both. If you have a problem with his methods, you can take it up with the 2 dead Tiger crews. The colonel left without another word. The next week, a training bulletin was distributed to all artillery units. Subject, employment of captured enemy weapons. It detailed procedures for quick assessment, basic operation, and safety protocols for German artillery. It specifically mentioned the Flak 36. It noted that the weapon could be effectively employed in the anti-tank role using direct fire methods, including manual bore sighting. The bulletin was signed by the same brigadier general. At the bottom in handwritten ink was a note: improvise, adapt, overcome. That's the American way. By December 31st, 1944, the 79th Field Artillery Battalion and the 244th Field Artillery Battalion had been formed using captured German weapons. They fired over 10,000 rounds through those guns. The sky guns that the Germans had designed to protect the fatherland were now being used to destroy it. The Americans took the enemy's best weapon and made it their own, not because they understood the engineering, but because they understood something more important. Desperation plus courage equals innovation. Frank Miller survived the war. He went back to Kansas, back to the farm. He never talked much about the war. He fixed tractors. He raised a family. He grew old. But every now and then, when a piece of machinery would not work, when a bolt was stuck or an engine would not turn over, his sons would see him get a certain look in his eye, a look of stubborn, quiet intensity. He would not look for the manual. He would not call a mechanic. He would grab a wrench, a big one, and he would make it work. His grandson asked him once, years later, about the story. The grandson had heard rumors from other veterans. He had heard about the Tigers and the German gun. "Grandpa," the boy asked, "is it true you killed tanks with their own weapon?" Miller was in his workshop rebuilding a carburetor. He did not look up. He kept his hands moving, his fingers stained with grease. "Yeah," he said, "it's true." The boy waited for more. Miller finally set down his tools. He looked at his grandson. "So you want to know the secret?" The boy nodded. "There is no secret," Miller said. "You just refuse to accept that something can't be done. The Germans built that gun to shoot down planes. Everyone said it couldn't shoot tanks, but a gun doesn't care what you point it at. A pipe is a pipe. You put a rock in one end, you light the fuse, and physics does the rest. The only difference between impossible and possible is whether you're willing to try." He picked up his tools again. "That's not just war. That's life. Don't let anyone tell you the tool is wrong. Make the tool work." We tell this story to ensure that the ingenuity of men like Frank Miller does not disappear into silence. History remembers the generals and the maps. It forgets the moments like this, when a farm boy looked at a masterpiece of enemy engineering and decided it was just a tool. The German 88 was a symbol of technological superiority. It was precise, complex, and deadly. But on a freezing ridge in November 1944, it met something stronger than German steel. It met the American refusal to quit. It met a group of dog faces who did not care about the rules, did not care about the odds, and certainly did not care about the instruction manual. They pointed the boogeyman at the ground, pulled the trigger, and stole the enemy's thunder. The lesson is not about guns. It is about people. It is about the moment when training ends and instinct begins. It is about the soldiers who looked at death rolling toward them on steel tracks and decided that dying was not an option. They made a choice. They refused the script. And in doing so, they proved something the enemy could never understand. You do not need to be smarter than your opponent. You do not need better equipment. You do not need a manual. You just need to be more stubborn. You need to look at the impossible and say, "Watch me." That is what Sergeant Frank Miller did on a muddy German ridge. That is what thousands of other forgotten soldiers did in 1,000 other forgotten fights. They were not heroes because they had special training. They were heroes because when the moment came, they refused to lose. Subscribe to this channel right now and turn on all notifications, because next week we are covering the story of the Marine who turned a broken airplane gun into a Medal of Honor weapon. Every single week we show you the moments when ordinary soldiers did extraordinary things because they had no other choice. This is not entertainment. This is education you will not find anywhere else. These are the stories that changed doctrine, that rewrote manuals, that proved the experts wrong. Thank you for watching, and thank you for understanding that the greatest weapon in any arsenal is not the gun, it is the man behind it. Hit subscribe right now, then hit like so YouTube shows this to more people who need to understand that ingenuity beats technology every single time. Drop a comment telling us where you are watching from and what other forgotten weapon you want us to cover next. This community is worldwide, and you are part of keeping these stories alive. We will see you in the next foxhole.